Welcome everybody. I'm so happy to see all of you. Many friends of old and new friends for what promises to be a wonderful conversation. My name is Megan Thomas. I am the interim president at Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial counties. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and wherever else I might be sitting, my back bedroom. I am coming to you live from the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay people in this place that we call San Diego. Really happy to be here with you all today. Some quick introductory housekeeping remarks. Please go ahead and let us know who you are in the chat box with your name, your title, a quote. Carlos prompted us earlier with the question about what you think is happening in civic engagement, maybe what you hope would happen. And throughout, please throw in your questions and we'll get our speakers to address them over the course of this conversation. We are recording this webinar and we'll share it with you along with any resources and PowerPoints that we have in a follow-up email. So don't worry about taking notes. You'll be able to go back and check those, and we'll have a quick poll at the end to help us improve. So with that, I'm sure you've heard some version of that about 27 million times, but I am so excited for the next hour or so that we have together. The people who we have gathered here, Jesse, Kira, Genevieve, Ramla, and all of you are, they're truly remarkable individuals. So, buckle your seats because we're in for a really fantastic conversation. I would not be exaggerating to say that I have a deep love and affection for all of them. Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial counties has a vision of a collaborative, impactful, equitable social change ecosystem. So why have we invited you to a conversation about civic engagement, and why are we doing it now? Well, when we think about social change, when we think about that ecosystem, that means voice. That means people being heard and us setting our priorities based on the change that we need to see and who demands change. It should be the folks who are out there experiencing the joys and the traumas of our everyday life. But to have voice is a privilege. We know that there are deep inequities in our systems in terms of the racism inherent in the way that we live, in terms of whether you have or don't have wealth, whether or not you have to show up to a job every day, or you can sit at your desk and zoom in and sit on hold for 3 hours so you can make a statement at a county board of supervisors meeting. And when I think about Catalyst's role, when we're bringing together philanthropy and investors, this is a privilege that we can help ensure that others gain. This is a privilege that we can, transmute through the place and the way that we make our investments. Whether your primary goal is food security or education or ensuring jobs for the next generation, what really is going to guarantee that, what really we need to be thinking about is how do we get change at the level of policies, about where tax dollars are spent, about who's allowed to access services and capital, about what it means to have the ability to live a full and complete life. So as we venture into this conversation, we're going to hear not just about what does it mean to be invested in our community, but what does it mean to actually be present? What does it mean to be to see the barriers cleared out, and what is it going to take from all of us? Who is that that group of what did you say, Carol? Like folks of goodwill, like people who would like to see a better world and just don't know how to get there. We're going to talk about that today because it is possible. This is a vision and an aspiration, and it has to be our future if what we want to achieve is a collaborative, impactful, equitable community. So I'm really pleased to introduce our speakers today. They're, as I said, wonderful folks, and the biographies for each of them is available online, and we'll include that in the follow-up email. But quickly, I'll just mention who they are, and you can wave, and then we'll dive in. We have Ramla Sahid of the Partnership for the Advancement of New Americans. You may know it as Penna. We're so happy to have you here, Ramla. We have Genevieve Jones-Wright, the Executive Director at Community Advocates for Just and Moral Governance, really remarkable impact litigation and community work. Dr. Kira Green at the Center on Policy Initiatives, amazing, impactful research and advocacy. She's also a wonderful member of our board of directors and on the steering committee for the Social Equity Collaborative Fund. And bringing them all together, our fabulous moderator for today, Dr. Jessie Mills, an associate professor in ethnic studies at the University of San Diego, another member of the board of directors at Catalyst, and another member of the steering committee for the Social Equity Collaborative Fund. And I'm really thrilled to hand it over to Jessie to take us into a dialogue about civic engagement, community advocacy, and the change that we all want to see.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's just thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real honor to be part of this conversation. I also am really humbled and very, very grateful to be invited to just help, help get this amazing panel to share your experiences and your leadership, your guidance. Again, my name is Jessie Mills. My pronouns are he, him, and they, them. I teach ethnic studies by day and just try to be really active in the community also by day and night and every other time as well. And this is a really important conversation, right? This is important because if we're gonna, get our community-driven and grassroots leadership and movements some support, we know that the sector of philanthropy and the organizations that are really focused on the community are going to play an essential role in that. So we're really thinking in general about what's going on in terms of how philanthropy shows up at the front lines of systemic and social change. So I'm happy to play this role as a moderator. I'm just going to be inviting our panelists to say a little bit more about themselves and their work and their sense of what kind of philanthropy supports are most rich for their critical efforts. We're going to take about, 20 minutes or so of a conversation that I'll be putting out questions and just encouraging the panelists to share. And then we'll have some time at the end for a more open question and answer period from each of you who's joined us before we wrap up. So that's a really exciting and dynamic opportunity here because of who we all have in this conversation. And just as a reminder, the objectives of this conversation are to help educate funders on emerging civic engagement and advocacy needs from the perspectives of community mobilizing and policy or legal strategy, and also to elevate the important work of local nonprofits to help bring more funding to local BIPOC-led work rather than funders merely extracting information. So I'm really going to open up just in general sort of panel comments on those objectives as well, because it's how you understand the importance of what we're doing here. But maybe we can just start with a brief round of introductions before we jump into questions. So thinking if you would just each say a little bit again about who you are and the work that you do, and from an organizational perspective, the sort of what is your mobilization and advocacy work. In particular, maybe if there's a story that helps to illustrate the impact and challenges of the work that you're doing. And I would just, maybe for this one, the shorter version, like a couple minutes, maybe a couple minute version of who you are and what work you're doing and its impact. And I would like to invite Ramla to begin, and then we'll go into Genevieve and Dr. Kira. So Ramla, would you please share in?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. It's great to see some of y'all's faces. It's been quite a minute, so appreciate the opportunity to be here and to join the conversation. My name is Ramla. I am the executive director of Penna, Partnership for the Advancement of New Americans. We work to advance the full economic, social, and civic inclusion of refugees in San Diego region throughout California and across the country. We were founded and led by newcomer and former refugees, and we use relational organizing and foster indigenous community leadership to build long-term political power in a culturally literate manner. And most recently, we deepened our investment in our youth and launched a youth congress that will identify and drive its own campaign priorities in the coming year. I want to pause there and ask Jesse for a time check, or I'm not sure how much time we have for the introduction.
Yeah, please. That was about a minute. So continue on, please.
Okay. So very quickly, Penna's priorities consistently center the fight for affordable housing, equity, inclusion. These battles can't be won unless our voices are heard and respected by government decision makers. Therefore, we're working to ensure year-round, nonpartisan civic engagement to build leadership and achieve our policy goals. An example of that is our census work. Census was seen as a critical catalyst and opportunity to engage and expand engagement in refugee communities across San Diego. So in 2019 and through 2020, into 2020, we convened and facilitated a refugee hub of 15 ethnic and religious-based organizations, trained and supported these partners to engage in 31 different languages and provided materials in 15 of those languages. And together contacted 47,000 Arab, African, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian community members about the census and about the elections. It was a huge success. And as a result, the census 2020 response rate increased dramatically over 2020 response rates in 82% of our census tracts, the ones that we targeted. We also knew census would motivate a continuum of engagement through the November elections and straight into redistricting. So we see redistricting as another opportunity to ensure our communities are seen, heard, and empowered as district boundaries are redrawn. This is our chance to ensure our communities are not split up because of partisan interests that are too often in control of the redistricting process. Redistricting is also, the misconception is it's a highly partisan process, but that's exactly why we need nonprofits, we need communities of interest, we need communities who are often, shut out of the process to engage, because those are the very communities who will be impacted, who will be split up. An example of that is City Heights, the community I live in. We were once part of 3 different city council districts. And so we know, and I know what it means to experience being ping-ponged between 3 council members. There's no accountability. And this is what happens when redistricting is driven by partisan interests and nonpartisan communities are basically shut out. So this year, we're actively engaging our Black immigrant communities, our Middle East, Arab, and South Asian communities to be vocal participants in that state and local process. And at the same time, we're advocating locally for tenant protections and other resources our communities need during this pandemic and beyond. And we're working with national partners to ensure effective end to Muslim and African ban implementation of resettlement reforms that give families real opportunities for sustaining jobs, healthcare, and housing. These fights are multi-year fights, right? So these are not fights that we can start in 1 year and win in a couple of months or a couple of weeks. These are multi-year fights. And so the investments from our communities and from our organizer team has to be a long shelf life in terms of our commitment to these issues. And we do this under the shadow of ongoing targeting and surveillance of activists and people of color in this country. And historically, right, in the 60s, the infamous COINTEL program basically was aimed to disrupt Black activists organizing for civil rights. And today, programs like Countering Violent Extremism and reports of the FBI inventing a new category of Black identity extremists are once again being used to demonize, discredit, and target our communities. The new focus on white supremacists, you might have heard on the news, you might have read about it, right? That there's a renewed focus on fighting white supremacist extremists and increased investments in surveillance tools and the creation of overly broad criminal codes that are a cause for alarm when it comes to our communities and what our experiences have been. So we have to remain vigilant. We have to continue to invest in our power building, because we know from experience that investments in anti-extremist programs and the creation of new criminal codes are just going to disproportionately be used to target Black immigrant refugee communities. So that is why Penna plays a really unique role, both in the national advocacy space and locally, and we are actively involved in the No Muslim Ban Ever campaign, for instance, and are playing a key role in a national coalition to draft and present a national security policy memo and agenda to the Biden administration. Our goal is to ensure national security loopholes are not built into immigration, domestic, and national security policies that would result in further surveillance and criminalization of our communities and could potentially prevent them from receiving immigration and refugee status and benefits. These are just some of the reasons why sustained investment in Black immigrant movement and civic engagement work is needed, and why we can't wait for funders to sort of put out an RFP that kind of fits us, right? Like, we have to move, because that's where our community needs us to go, and hope, there are resources to do the work, but often, we have to make these decisions with our communities, and because these are, real life, they're the real life implications of some of these policies are having directly on our families. Like, we can't ignore that. So I look forward to the conversation today, and I know my co-panelists are amazing people who have a lot more color to add to this conversation. So I'll stop there.
Wow, Ramla, just asking you to summarize the extent of the work that you're doing with Penna and in the communities that you're helping to bring visibility and voice to. You blew me away. That was just a few minutes of you really pulling together a tremendous and powerful analysis about the way that state institutions and policies and just everyday life experiences just are direct obstacles, right, to so many of our community members trying to participate, in the economy and the political system. Beautiful. We're going to have lots to pick up on that. I'd like to invite Genevieve to please go ahead and introduce yourself and your work.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Genevieve Jones Wright. I am a proud native San Diegan, and I was a public defender for 13 years here in my home county, and before that was a public defender in Riverside County. I co-founded, along with another Black woman attorney, Community Advocates for Just and Moral Governance, or MOGO, because that is a very long name. And MOGO is an impact litigation organization that holds government accountable to all people, especially those who are disenfranchised. I'm not only the co-founder or a co-founder, but I am also the executive director. Our work at MOGO is the daily work to achieve racial and social justice. We launched just under a year ago on March 7th, 2020. Now, if you remember where we were, then you would either agree with me that it had to be destiny, kismet, the will of the creator, but I always say that I thank goodness that we launched when we did, because our free legal services and advocacy efforts have been sorely needed during the pandemic and the protests that ensued after the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. As an impact litigation organization, we are dedicated to restructuring government and, like I said, achieving racial and social justice. And so we've been uniquely positioned to fight both of the viruses that plague San Diego County, the virus of COVID-19 and the virus of systemic racism. We said from the very start that our work would be driven by the community and would be community oriented, and that we would name things as they are. And so our work is rooted in the acknowledgement that all of our systems here in this country are rooted in white supremacy, and that they all still suffer the effects of it. After January 6th, I saw a lot of statements made by organizations and elected and public officials denouncing the violence of the insurrection. And what I noticed was that none of them denounced what begat the violence, which is white supremacy. And for me, it really confirmed the fact that MOGO was doing the work that needs to be done. When we talk about racial and social justice, I know that these are gargantuan feats, but with us all doing the work together, I know that we can achieve things like equitable voting rights, have real climate justice. We can have an equitable and fair healthcare system. We can conquer racial injustice. We can do away with the gender and racial wage gap disparities. so on and so forth. And so over the past year, we've joined with the community, and we've joined with the community to do the work in changing policies, to fight against the various injustices, and to hold our government accountable to all people, especially those who are a part of marginalized groups. We work in coalition with other community organizations. And of course, we live in and work in communities that we do work with. If I can just give one story, I would give the story of Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz was a community member, is a community member, where his case really demonstrated the failures in our systems and how it is impacted by white supremacy, even when we probably don't recognize it as that. Mr. Cruz is a Spanish-speaking gentleman who is a taxi driver. He was wrongfully accused by another taxi driver. And as a result of the false accusations, Mr. Cruz lost his taxi license and lost his ability to make money, wound up in a homeless shelter. And that's how we met Mr. Cruz. He came to us after he tried to fight against the suspension of his license, and the system failed him. He brought in witnesses that were not allowed to testify. He was given documents in English that were not translated. He was not given the ability to access interpretation services. And so when I met Mr. Cruz at a community engagement kind of clinic, I said, we're going to take your case. And so we took his case, we did an administrative appeal, we brought in an interpreter on his behalf. We fought for him to actually have due process. And not only did we fight, we won. And I'm happy to say that Mr. Cruz not only got his taxi license back, he was able to get into housing because we also cleared up that false accusation, both in the criminal courts and in the court of public opinion by some of our county agencies. And so this was an opportunity for us to make recommendations to the sheriff, who oversees licensing and registration issues. And so we wrote up recommendations for changes in policies, and I'm happy to say that they're implementing many of those policies. But these are just some of the things that we see daily in the systems that we have in place, where being Anglo and English speaking is centered, and it has a tremendous effect on community members. And I will just stop there.
Wow, Genevieve, what a powerful vision of how important legal advocacy is and links to so many other critical areas of the well-being of our communities and our ability to have lives that are just, lives that are equitable. Thank you so much for that illustration as well. Dr. Kira, would you please go ahead and introduce yourself and your work?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. I knew that this was a bad idea to be on this panel and go last anytime. So I just want to say I am honored to be on this panel, and I will be pulling up the rear for the whole conversation today. So my name is Dr. Kira Green. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a trained sociologist. I am a former sociology professor, and I'm currently the executive director at the Center on Policy Initiatives. CPI, I like to say CPI is the San Diego People's Think Tank. And I'd like to make the point that we're also an action organization. Since 1997, CPI has been serving a unique role in the San Diego region. We provide analysis, policy solutions, public education, and we build alliances or coalitions that help advance racial and economic justice, with the express intent of doing so for the benefit of the diverse communities of working people in the San Diego region. It's important to me that people recognize that our work is done through coalition. And one thing that can be difficult to talk about the work of CPI is that none of it is just us, right? If you're doing it in a coalition, you're always talking about the collaborative work of others. And I think we'll talk more about that in this discussion, but the challenges in the funding space of talking about work that you're a part of, that you're not the complete package of. So we do this work in this intersectional way with the racial justice lens, because for me, the important thing is to remember that working people are not single issue people. We can't be. It's just not possible. The web of things that hold working families down are across all of the issue areas. And so we have to be focused on that. I think it's sometimes hard to wrap around all those different things I said about what CPI does. So I thought I would focus on a particular aspect of our work that I think highlights all the different contributions we try to make to this area of work. And that is our work around budget advocacy at the City of San Diego and at San Diego County government. So to do that work, we, first of all, see one of CPI's roles is to contribute to the research that goes into understanding how the institution operates, what resources governments have, what processes exist within them, and opportunities for change, and then making sure that that information is, to the best of our ability, translated into a way that's easily received by everyone. So all too often, one of the barriers to participating in change in government is simply that the system itself is too complicated and hard to get a grasp of. And so it's a way, it becomes a wall that's nearly invisible, but that pushes people out. So that's one role we play. Another is that organizations that have doing this kind of work and need these resources are also being pulled to do all kinds of other things. And so one of our jobs is to create the space, literally organize space for people to come together, keep the meetings together, keep track of the things we want to work on together to facilitate collaborative work. So that's our organizing, a portion of our organizing work. And part of facilitating that space is to ensure that we solve a problem that often faces communities that are acting to make change. And that is that we get pitted against one another. So we get told, if you are here advocating for, say, criminal justice reform and that takes money, well, how are we supposed to do that when these people over here want us to invest in more park space? And so it becomes as if what your top issue is today, you can't have both of those things. And the battle can easily become pitting those groups against one another. The outcome of that is often that nobody gets what they're advocating for. It's not true that we're actually pitted against each other. What we recognize is that we're pitted against a system that doesn't want to make change and does not want to return resources back to communities that are disadvantaged. So this space helps, I think, to remind us of that, if we were in any danger of going away from it, a reminder that we're on the same team. And so one example of how that work manifests, and I think it speaks to the needs of this type of work, is that I came to work at CPI in 2014. The job I got was a job to do budget advocacy. There had been budget advocacy work at CPI for a few years before that, and this was a dedicated position focused on budget advocacy. We had been doing work at the city, and the organization wanted to launch work at the county level in the same format of a collaboration. At the county level, when we began, the first budget meeting I ever went to see how the San Diego County budget was passed, a group of us went, we'd organized early, and we showed up. And, it's San Diego. So some of us arrived on time and some of us arrived a little later. And by the time the second group of people came, I actually saw them as I was walking out of the building because the hearing started. The Board of Supervisors announced, this is our budget. The budget comment period is open. Here's a presentation of how much money is spent in this budget. It took about 5 minutes. We had organized 3 speakers to speak to issues that people wanted to see in the budget. They spoke. The board at the time didn't even acknowledge that they had spoken. They were just like, okay. And then they closed the hearing. And this was on a budget that's $6 billion. That was the level of engagement that was happening. So we understood that we had a big task in front of us. By the way, the day that budget was released, there was not a single reporter in the room, right, to cover the story of what happened in that space. And so we began doing this work. And one of the things we had learned is that it was incredibly important to have a hearing that people could attend. So the first thing we asked for was an evening budget hearing. Can you present in the next year? We said, can you present this budget, but can you do it in the evening where people could come and give public comment? And I'll tell you, it was easy. This is very rare in this work. It was easy to get that first one. They were like, sure. Because what they had told us in these meetings is people don't care about the county budget. And the reason that they're not coming is because we're doing a great job. So we don't need to hold this type of hearing. So anyway, they had an evening budget hearing. And over 100 people showed up and participated in a hearing, gave feedback, gave comment. Absolutely nothing that we demanded in that hearing was incorporated into that budget. 0. So the next year, we showed up again. And this time, we had an evening budget hearing. And almost 1,000 people showed up for the evening budget hearing. We filled the main room, we filled the overflow room, we filled the cafeteria, we had people outside participating in the evening budget hearing. And coming out of that hearing, we got one thing out of this list, remember I said organizations come together, make a set of priorities. We got one thing that we asked for. And then the next year, we got no evening budget hearing. It was taken away. So unfortunately, that next year came around the time of an election. We got one member of the Board of Supervisors who was willing to push, and we got the evening budget hearing back. We continued throughout this whole time doing advocacy, telling the stories. Another part of CPI's work, along with, again, every single part of it, the research part is done in collaboration. The coalition organizing, done in collaboration. But this communications part of recruiting reporters, like helping to tell them, do you understand what's happening here? Having meetings with them, doing the work of getting them to focus on county government. That's invisible work that happens, takes effort, but it was important if we're going to tell the story of what's happening. And so I'll end the story by saying, it's not a victory, you never win the whole thing, but what happened just recently is that we had a state of the county. And during that state of the county, Nathan Fletcher talked about what the plans were for the county. And I don't want to brag on the people of the Invest in San Diego Families Coalition, some of whom may be here. But I will say that there was a great deal of what was in the most inspiring things that people heard in that were things that were developed, programs and policies and ideas that came out of this coalition and out of the ideas generated by people working together. And every time I say that, I get chills because to me, that's the beauty of this work. But it takes, I want you to hear in that story, the evening budget hearings of 3 and 4 years of work to get to the place. And that's building on decades of other types of work to get to the place where you could have a hearing. You could go from, you can't even have people know what's happening in a budget to, you can have someone describing the future of this county and having it incorporate the mission and values and programs and ideas of grassroots community organizations. So I'll stop there.
Wow, what a critical view of, so many of us just assume, yeah, we're just going to work in collaboration. We're just going to work together with other organizations without due respect, right? For the patience and the effort and the labor and the need to build, right? Build upon effort and build upon sometimes setbacks. This beautiful illustration. Thank you so much for that. If you have additional questions about the amazing work that our panelists are doing, please make sure you bring that back in the Q&A period. So I basically got a question for each of you. The way I'd like to do this portion of the of our conversation here is I'm going to go in reverse order and just direct a question at each of you. So the first question I'll direct at for Dr. Kira to respond. I'm just going to kind of ask you to work in a 2-minute. I'm going to give you some signals as well for that. So we're looking for just kind of like brief and direct answers. And then I'm just going to invite if anyone else, Genevieve or Ram, you would like to add anything, you're not obligated to, and then I'll move the next question to Genevieve and on. And so we'll just have a few questions here to illustrate some more of your sense of working with philanthropy and working with funders and working in collaboratives. And then we'll be able to sort of open up the end portion for some conversation from our guests, okay? All right, so the first question, it came up in a number of ways, but right, the 2020 voter turnout was, it was almost a record, it almost hit sort of San Diego's record of turnout, right? And so this is a real indicator of the important and successful work, right, of organizations on the ground doing mobilization. But so I'm curious about how, this participation, this civic participation showed up in your work. And also the question is, how can philanthropy, like what are your ideas on how philanthropy can support that momentum that started up and work for long-term and ongoing civic engagement? So can you go ahead and please begin?
Yeah, I'll start with this to say, I think that's a big question, and I know the other panelists have a lot to say about it. I will say that probably the most controversial thing I'll say about it is that I think philanthropy has to invest in giving political money to nonprofit organizations, the political arms of those nonprofit organizations, if there's going to be long-term building on what we saw in terms of voting engagement. And the reason for that is because really and truly, there are a lot of elected officials who absolutely can run on a platform. They're the best of what we have. They've listened, they have the talking points, but what we need is the ability to continue engaging people in these kind of everyday governmental processes, like I'm describing budgets, passing individual policies. And when people get engaged, civically engaged, and what they experience is a system that does not listen to them and then sends them back, if all we have to offer to them is like, well, you come out and you vote again. But they're saying to us, but have the candidates changed? Are the people, like, how do I know who they are? And so many of these offices that really shape people's lives, they're not even aware of who they are. I'll just give the example of like going back to the County Board of Supervisors. When we started this work, and it's probably not that much different now, there were so many people that if you ask them who represents you, they didn't know, right? So, and if you try to then describe to them, like this person, and this is what's true of nonprofits like ours, as a C3, we can talk completely about the elected official who's there today. What are they doing? What are they not doing? But as soon as it becomes about a political race, we get very limited about how we're allowed to talk about them during election seasons, right? We can only do the nonpartisan voter turnout work as organizations, and that as C3 organizations. So that's a real challenge. And yet the ability to raise the money that helps influence the other parts of this system is really hard to come by, and is sometimes treated, when we talk about wanting to do this type of work, is treated as somehow less pure than getting people to vote. But I don't think there's any purity in something that by itself, if something by itself is not effective, right? We can't keep offering people ineffective ways of engaging with the system, or just a tiny portion of what they need in order to make change. So I think that's a big part of what needs to happen in order to engage it. One other thing I'll just say about it is that, you know, there are many other elements, but that's the one I thought must be difficult.
Love it, right? You cannot underestimate the importance of consciousness activation through political participation. I mean, that's almost like the precondition for like how disempowerment continues to work, is just don't give the stake, don't give the consciousness that you even have a voice. And the importance of supporting that is critical. Thank you for lifting that up. I do want to open up for Genevieve or Ramla, if you would like to add anything on the question of building on the momentum of civic engagement. Maybe a minute or a couple minutes of a response.
Just very briefly, I think it's really important to recognize that reckoning and repair still lie ahead, right? Like that we can't take this experience of, you know, this massive engagement that's happened, the few wins that we've gotten, the few races that that have given us seats back. That's all really great, but if that doesn't change, if that doesn't translate into something meaningful for the lives of the people who we're working with, then, you know, then we'll have apathy. We'll have, you know, why even engage? Why is this important? And we'll have even a harder hill to climb, right? Because up until this moment, it's been about education. It's been about getting people to vote. It's been about really helping people understand what's at stake. And they got it, and they turned out in record numbers, right? And so that turnout needs to translate into meaningful wins for people's lives. Otherwise, we risk people just kind of going back to their homes, closing the door and saying, you know, that's not really for me. And so what Kira mentioned about really making sure that we're investing in, continuing to invest in increasing investment in our civic engagement and movement building work is going to be really critical, because now we have to hold those electeds accountable. We have to have meaningful, we have to translate that into meaningful wins, meaningful policy. So people know what it means to get out and vote, elect people who share our values, and then those values turn into policy, right? Turn into investments back into the community. So that's really what is ahead. And that can't happen without real conversation about also the harm that's been caused, and repair, you know, what it looks like, and reimagine in a future where we repair that harm, right? And so those are, you know, that's the restorative aspect of the moment that we can take advantage of and really, you know, hold up and lift up, because that can be an affirming and hopeful space to kind of live, right? And so that requires investment. That requires all of our work to even deepen, and we need to invest even more in. And so, yeah, I'll stop there because I'm rambling.
No, you're not at all. And thank you also for just lifting up so powerfully. Let's just bury that perception of our communities that people are not invested, right? That people don't care, right? That they're too busy elsewise. Thank you for these really important examples of explaining that. Okay, I'm gonna move a question. Genevieve, I'd like you to begin answering this one, please. This is a question about, what are some of the ways that you have seen funders be supportive in collaborative work? What has worked well?
Over this past year, I've had terrific opportunities to build what I believe are sustaining relationships. And so I would want to lift that up, having healthy relationships with funders. One that comes to mind is TCE. I consider them a very supportive partner in the work. And it all came from me believing, because I knew that they completely understood the work that we were doing and the importance of it after just having one conversation. It was one wonderful conversation that led to them being a supportive partner. And the thing that really struck me about their support of the work was that it was the complete opposite of what I had been hearing about as far as criticisms with funding, not about them, but just from other nonprofits, how funders will throw a small dollar at a large problem or a large project and have very huge reporting requirements. And they really took the time to make the process very easy. And I felt as if we were partnering in the work from start to finish. The other part of it that I really appreciated was that there wasn't any restrictions on the funds. As a young organization, that was so important to us as we tried to build a team, to not have the funds be hamstrung by certain projects or be limited. And so for me, that would be an example of some of the supportive work that I've seen from partners in the work with us. And then I would be completely remiss if I didn't personally name Megan, who has just been an amazing partner in the work from the very start. And again, it really came from just getting that feeling that she cared. She was interested in the work that we did. We were human, the work was human, and you can't ask for anything better than that. So that would be my answer to that one.
I love it, right? You're centering relationship and partnership, right? So these aren't just jargon words you're adding on to it. No, you're talking about an actual fabric of a connection that is part of the ways that you've seen funders successfully working. I'd definitely like to open up an opportunity for either Ramla or Dr. Kira to make a brief comment on this as well in terms of the good examples you've seen.
I'll just say two things that represent really good examples from a local funder. They did two things when the crisis of the co-crises of COVID and then the space created by the uprisings in the spring. They came first of all and they said, what do you need? We want to have conversations. We know that you work in this collaborative space. We want to have conversations with you about what you're hearing, what you're seeing. Would it be helpful if we gave you a grant that was expressly for that purpose, so that you could have the time to do this and you could think about whoever's engaging your organization in this, then you'd have resources to cover some other spaces that need to be covered. Like, it's not free to spend time doing this. So that was amazing. It was the first time that's ever happened, that someone said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to ask for a lot of conversations. We're going to fund for those conversations. And then second, they use those conversations to say, what's happening that we wouldn't normally see? What's going on? What's a set of projects that you have an eye on? And it wasn't that we got to make decisions, but we got to have a conversation of at least like, this is something interesting that we want to support. This is another organization doing something seems new, seems really relevant in this moment to us. And we want to make you aware of it. And it felt like the first time, not the first time, it was one of the times when someone came to us, not understanding that we're not in competition with our partners and respecting that we would have great things to say about other people's work in this community.
Lifting each other up. Wow. Creating the space for conversation and connection. Love it. Let me go ahead and introduce the final question that I wanted to lay out, which is, I'm going to direct this to Ramla. Would you please start us off with, is there anything that you want the audience to know, in particular about this advocacy and civic engagement work? Like, just what do you think people might need to know, or what would you want them to know leaving this conversation?
That we need to share power. Ultimately, this is what the conversation's about, and that the other side's not just going to give it up and say, "Hey, come through the door and have a seat and tell us what to do," right? So we've got to go in with the expectation that we're going to have to both work really hard to make sure that our government, our lawmakers, folks are able to listen to our communities, and they can't do it if our communities are absent or invisible or just not there, right? And so we've got to bring our communities with us, and we've got to be rooted in community. We can't have advocates speaking on behalf of large segments of our communities without even consulting them. So it has to be authentic. It has to be rooted in community organizing and community relationships. It's got to make sure that community voices are respected and at the table as equitable partners. And that equitable partnership and respect is not going to just be handed to us. We've got to earn it and we've got to win it. And that requires investment. And it requires resources, right? To make sure that we're educating people, we're giving them the tools and the language, right, to participate effectively, and that there's authentic demand. And authentic demand, what it calls for is for folks to be really be given the opportunity to really understand everything that's going on. Their informed consent can only be given when they have a full understanding of the issue, and it's rooted in their lived experience. So that's where you start. But then around how government works, the processes, all of that. And so that requires investment. And I hope that we can deepen investment in civic engagement and activism in San Diego. And it's about risk taking. And so hopefully we can all be brave enough to step into that space together.
A powerful statement, right, on ways to, in your work, value the perspectives of the community leadership doing the work, right? So sharing the power isn't just an abstract concept. It's a way about actually finding ways to lift up, amplify, and support the voice and the actions of those who are doing the work. Genevieve or Kira, would you like to add anything on sort of your thoughts about what you would like folks to know walking away from this conversation?
I would always defer to Dr. Green if she wants to speak first, but I do have a couple cents to add to that. Because we are here talking about systems. We usually say, Rome wasn't built in one day, but neither were the systems that we have in place. And in fact, one system, after it was dismantled, was replaced by another form of the same system, and so on and so forth. And that's the history of this country. And so when we talk about things like structural and systemic racism, we can't expect to dismantle these systems that need change within a year. And so I think it's important to talk about the need to understand that some of the work will have to go beyond a year, go beyond even 2 years, that we have to be able to invest in long-term projects and be able to really invest in those projects if we want to see the change that we so desperately need. The last thing that I will say is that some of the work that we do and the advancements that we see from the work and the progress that we made are really not measurable. For instance, we do a lot of work around IEP advocacy, where we work with parents and we empower them to be advocates for their children in the classrooms. And it's even more of a need now that there's virtual learning. But in this space where we're giving parents tools and support they need to advocate for their children, sometimes the metric is, were you feeling prepared when you got into that IEP meeting? Did you feel comfortable with speaking in that IEP meeting? Sometimes it's a question about whether someone spoke for the first time during a city council meeting, and those aren't necessarily quantifiable, but these are measures of the work doing the work. And I think that that is something that is often missing from the conversation when we're being asked to measure the progress of the work that we've done. Some things just can't be measured by the conventional ways, I guess is what I'm saying.
Beautifully put, right? Dr. Kira, please continue.
If I could just say briefly, I think I want to just say that I want to speak about organizations that are not like CPI, actually the ones that do the work that helps make our work actually have meaning. And that is organizations that do organizing. And I've been saying this thing lately that crisis mobilizes people, crises like we've seen, but it doesn't organize them. And it's people who organize people. And it takes a long time to do people-to-people organizing. It's labor intensive, it's emotional work, it's all the things to build trust. But the organized people are the people who change the world. And so you have to make that investment in mobilizing. And it's all the things my sister said, like it takes time, it takes investment, it takes, believing in change. And it's not always measurable in moment to moment. The conversations you've had, the impact they're making, it builds on itself. And I think the second thing I'll say is that often people think about civic engagement and what's possible based on polling. And I just want to remind people that polling is as discriminatory as anything else. Most of the polling we see about political action polls people who are registered to vote. That dismisses all kinds of people who are not able to register to vote or have been so dismissed by the system that they want. And so just to say, voters are not all conservative, but voters are more conservative than the people overall. And so if you want to know where things are going, you have to be talking to people doing grassroots work because they have relationships through organizing with people that are different than what you can get from any other source of information.
Wow, thank you. This is, there's just your work. I know we have just maybe started to scratch the surface on what you do and the importance of your experience and your perspectives. And hopefully like being introduced to your work is really something that for some folks here on the call, I mean, if they don't know who you are, they do now. And we've got real deal folks that are absolutely leading conversations and nourishing our communities here on the panel. We do have just a short few minutes left. We have some questions that came in from the participants, which I'll read through briefly, and we'll see if we have a minute or so to respond to some of them. And then we'll turn it back over to Megan for a close. But hopefully you're really viewing this as an introduction, right? Maybe you're meeting some of the panelists for the first time and hearing about their work for the first time. But please continue, reach out to them, find ways to interact, learn from their experience and support the work that they're doing. So thank you everyone on the panel. So some questions that we have, I'll read through. As someone who sits on a community foundation board, I would like to know what you would suggest for us to more actively reach out with nonprofits in the minority community. Second question is, if a nonprofit cannot understandably wait for a months-long RFP process, how can funders work with nonprofits to understand their work and impact, to know the funding is the right one among a variety of worthy options? And the third question in the chat is direct funding to media or maybe funding for NGO communications part of civic engagement? These are thoughtful questions, and I think there's cues in some of the answers that really highlight like possibilities of creative ways boards and organizations can be working even outside of an RFP or funding cycle or an evaluation cycle in order to be maintaining an ongoing relationship and figuring out sort of standards of how to measure progress, measure impact, measure importance. There's a lot of learning that can be done in relationship. And then the issue around communications, just how important that is, to the work that you're doing. But maybe, I know we're down to just the last couple of minutes, and what I'd like to do is just invite any of you that have kind of direct advice to folks working on boards and organizations of sort of, and this is just like a quick sort of like 10 to 30 second kind of take that you have on just some quick advice, so that we're going to be able to kind of wrap this up. We'll see if we can hit a couple of these questions. Can we go ahead and go with Ramla and then back through our panel?
Sorry, took a minute to unmute. So I'll respond to the month-long RFP process. Yeah, flexibility is important. What's more important is relationships. And so if you're in relationship with community groups, grassroots organizing folks, you'll often know sort of what's bubbling up from those conversations and from that engagement. And hopefully that means you can deploy resources more quickly as things are popping up and being identified, because you've got discretionary funding here or there that you can mobilize quickly. Or, you know, there's a practice to set aside rapid response funding within your portfolio that is just dedicated to that kind of nimble like approach. So I'll stop there and see if others have responses to the other questions.
Very practical and on point. Genevieve?
I can make this under 10 seconds. Amen to what Ramla said. And I do think that relationships are very important.
I'm good with that too. Fund communications, but don't tell people you're funding communications. Tell them that you'll fund what they need and make it clear that you will fund comms work, if that's what you want to do.
Again, beautiful questions, and I encourage you to continue these conversations, each of you in your organizational and your leadership capacities. Reach out, you know, continue developing these relationships. Thank you so much for being actively present and participating in the chat and giving us your energy if you're on the camera. It's been, again, a real honor. Ramla, Genevieve, Kira, just literally three of my heroes, and just people who are just move my heart in terms of the kind of possibilities for our communities. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'll turn it back to Megan.
Thank you, Jesse. I could not have said it better. And let me just add your name to that list of people who are an inspiration and a heart-centered, amazing person. Thanks, everyone. I don't have much to recap other than to say that this is the real work. If we're talking about long-term change, we have to address people's needs in the moment. And there's many of them that are exceedingly apparent right now, but we shouldn't be in a place where it's a Herculean effort to get one win, right? Like to get a computer for a kid to have education, or to make sure that someone isn't hungry tomorrow. We want to get to the point where that is just the norm, where everybody's education is secure, where no one has to suffer from abuse in their job, where no one has to give up their health in order to pay their rent. And so we've heard that this takes a long time, that this is heart and soul work, that it is an emotional toil. When I think about the people who are out there reaching out to community members and supporting them to know how to show up to their child's educational meeting or a county board of supervisors meeting to express their voice, I think about what we have all experienced in our own lives in the last few months, and know that that's what these people are doing every single day. So it's on us to be in that fight with them. And so I offer Catalyst up as a place to come, have more conversations like this, explore what you can do. We're talking about like make a little change. When I think about exercise and I'm lying in the bed and I just don't want to do anything, I tell myself, you know what? Anything is more than nothing. So like get up and just walk around the block today. Like that's okay. You don't got to run 5 miles, just walk around the block. We're here to walk around the block with you, and eventually we'll find that we've done a marathon. Our community deserves this, and I have just been never more aware that Jesse said something about like we want to live just lives. We want to live lives that are just, and I can't live my life anymore if I don't know that the folks around me are living whole lives. I've cheated, I've sinned, I have not done my all, and I can't live with myself if I'm not doing more. And so I just admire all of you for spending your afternoon with us here today. We'll send you the recording, we'll send you resources, and reach out. Let's keep talking. Whatever you're thinking, we're here to talk about it with you, because this is our life's work. Thank you for everything you do. Please fill out the evaluation. I think it's like 2 questions that just popped up on your screen. And there's more to come. Thank you for everything you do, Genevieve, Ramla, Kira, Jesse. Thank you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.